My daughter said my 70th birthday party would damage her reputation. I just nodded and walked away. But I had a plan for her big awards night. The host called my name. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My life as I approached my 70th year had settled into a rhythm of quiet, scholarly contentment. My home, a charming but unassuming brownstone on a leafy historic street, was not a palace of modern glass and steel. It was a repository of stories. Every wall was lined with books, art history, poetry, first edition novels, their spines a warm colorful tapestry that spoke of a life lived in the company of ideas and beauty. The art that hung between the bookshelves was not the massive, abstract, investment-grade canvases that were in vogue in the circles my daughter now traveled. They were smaller, quieter, more intimate pieces, a breathtaking 19th-century landscape by a lesser-known Hudson River School painter. I'd discovered in a dusty shop in Brussels a series of intricate botanical sketches from the 1700s, a beautiful but unsigned portrait of a young woman that I knew from my years of research, and a deep instinctual connection to the paint, was from the studio of a minor but brilliant Renaissance master. These were my treasures. Their value was not in their price tag, though it was, I knew, substantial and growing with every passing year. Their value was in their history, their beauty, their soul. My name is Dr. Evelyn Hayes. For 40 years I was the chief curator of the city's premier art museum, a career that had brought me immense joy, a modest but comfortable academic salary, and most importantly access to the world's greatest art. My late husband David had been a fellow academic, a brilliant but equally modestly paid history professor. We had lived a life rich in culture, in travel, in ideas, but not in overt material luxury. We were, in the eyes of the world, and certainly in the eyes of our only daughter Simone, comfortably, respectably and rather boringly middle class. What the world did not know was that I had a secret. My quiet, academic eye for art was not just a passion, it was a gift, a kind of financial superpower. I could spot an undervalued masterpiece, a forgotten artist, a piece of antique furniture with a hidden provenance from across a crowded auction house. Over the decades, I had quietly and with a shrewd, calculated precision that would have shocked my bohemian academic colleagues, built a formidable private portfolio of art and antiques. I had bought low, sold high and reinvested over and over again. The modest professor's salary had been a cover for a private multi-million-dollar fortune I had built entirely on my own. A fortune that now, in my retirement, was valued at a comfortable and very quiet $7.5 million. But I had no interest in the performance of wealth. I found the modern obsession with designer labels, with luxury brands, with the constant clamoring and deeply insecure display of status, to be profoundly and almost comically vulgar. My car was a 10-year-old, reliable and deeply unflashy sedan. My clothes were elegant, well-made pieces from small independent designers I admired, not garments emblazoned with the logos of a global fashion house. My greatest luxury was not a handbag, it was a first edition Virginia Woolf. My wealth was my own, a private source of security and, more importantly, a tool for the things I truly valued, supporting the arts, quietly funding scholarships for promising young art history students at my beloved university, and traveling the world to see its beauty firsthand, not from the window of a five-star hotel, but from the dusty streets of a small, forgotten village. I lived a life of immense privilege, but it was a quiet, internal privilege, one that did not need to be announced to the world. My daughter Simone had never understood this. She had grown up in this house of books and quiet, authentic art, and had, with the simple, brutal logic of an ambitious and deeply insecure child, tragically misinterpreted its understated elegance as a lack of ambition, as a sign of a small and slightly impoverished life. She loved me, I knew, in her own conditional way, but her love was tinged with a faint but constant sense of pity and a deep and very corrosive embarrassment, and that pity, I was about to discover, was a far more wounding thing than any overt dislike could ever be. My quiet legacy was, in her eyes, a liability. My daughter Simone lived in a different city, a different universe. Her world was not one of quiet historical substance, but of loud, ephemeral and very public branding. At 38, she was a high-flying public relations executive, a woman who had clawed her way to the near top of a very competitive and very superficial profession. Her life was a meticulously curated performance, and her stage was the entire unblinking world of social media. She lived in a minimalist penthouse apartment that looked less like a home and more like a high-end furniture showroom, a landscape of white walls, gray sofas and a single artfully placed fiddle leaf fig tree. It was a space designed not for living, but for being photographed. She drove a leased white, luxury SUV, a vehicle she often featured in her Instagram posts, a prop in the ongoing narrative of her success. Her entire life, it seemed to me, was a brand, and she was her own most important client. She was obsessed with appearances, with the semiotics of success. She spoke in a language of optics, of messaging, of personal branding. She was, in her own words, building an empire, but it was an empire built, not of brick and mortar, but of likes, of followers, of the carefully managed perception of a flawless and very successful life. She was married to Julian Sterling, a partner at a prestigious corporate law firm. He was a handsome, smooth, and deeply condescending man who fully supported and participated in his wife's relentless social climbing. They were a power couple, their marriage a strategic merger of his established professional status and her modern social media savvy. Now Simone was on the cusp of her greatest triumph. She was a finalist for the city's top PR award, the Golden Quill for PR Professional of the Year. The upcoming awards night, a glittering black tie gala, was the single most important event of her career. To win would be to finally and irrevocably arrive. It would be the ultimate validation of her brand, the crowning achievement of a lifetime spent in the desperate and exhausting pursuit of external approval. In her mind, her mother, the quiet, academic and deeply unbranded Dr. Evelyn Hayes, was a direct threat to this brand. My life, my style, my very being was a source of deep and very secret shame for her. She saw my comfortable book-filled home as cluttered and dated. She saw my love of classic timeless clothing as frumpy. She saw my academic career, a source of such profound pride for me, as a humble and slightly pathetic profession. When she would visit, she would look at the priceless museum-quality art on my walls, not with an eye for its beauty or its history, but with a cool, appraising gaze that was clearly trying to calculate its monetary value, a calculation she was, I knew, spectacularly bad at. She saw a dusty old painting, not a masterpiece. She saw in my quiet, unpretentious life a reflection of her own humble origins, a past she was desperate to erase, to Photoshop out of the perfect, glossy picture of her new successful life. The daughter of a humble professor was not the brand she was trying to build, and her mother, she had decided, was a reputational risk that needed to be managed. My 70th birthday was a week away. It was a milestone, a number that felt both significant and strangely unreal. I had not expected a grand celebration. I was not a woman who enjoyed being the center of attention, but I had hoped for a simple, quiet acknowledgement. A family dinner, a shared bottle of wine, a moment of connection with the daughter who had become in recent years more of a distant and very busy business associate than a child. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon, my heart full of a quiet, and in retrospect a deeply naive hope. Simone, darling, I began, my voice warm, I know how incredibly busy you are with the awards night coming up, but I was hoping we could steal a few hours for a quiet dinner next week. For my birthday. The silence on the other end of the line was not a thoughtful silence. It was a tense, irritated silence, the sound of a very busy, very important person being bothered with a small and deeply inconvenient personal matter. Mom, please, she finally said, her voice a sharp, exasperated sigh. I can't think about that right now. I am literally in the middle of a crisis with the seating chart for the gala. Do you have any idea how politically sensitive that is? I have 2 tech CEOs who can't be seated at the same table, and a city councilwoman who has to have a clear line of sight to the stage. It's a nightmare. I see, I said, my own voice a little smaller now, the hopeful warmth beginning to cool. Well, I just thought, look, she interrupted, her voice now a brisk, dismissive and utterly, completely, unapologetic command. I can't. A big public party for you right now? Or even a small family thing. It's not a good look. It would be a distraction, a big 70-year-old birthday party, for my humble academic mother. It would be a disaster for my image right now. It would damage my reputation. The words, so stark, so brutal, so utterly, breathtakingly selfish, landed like a physical blow. Damage her reputation. My own mother's milestone birthday, a celebration of my life, of my very existence was a reputational risk. I was not a person to be loved and celebrated. I was a branding problem to be managed. And then, as if to add a final cruel twist of the knife, I heard a sound in the background on her end. A man's voice. Her husband Julian. He was laughing. A low, condescending, and deeply, deeply amused chuckle. He was a party to this cruelty. He was an audience for my humiliation. Simone, her work done, her boundaries set, then delivered the final and most devastating line. "Don't expect a party, Mom," she said, her voice now a little softer. A final pathetic attempt at a kind of gentle, pitying concern that was in itself an insult. "It's just better for everyone this way." And with that she was gone. The call was over, the dismissal was absolute, and I was left standing in the quiet of my beautiful book-lined study. A 70-year-old woman who had just been informed that her own life was a professional inconvenience to her only child. The phone call ended, but the silence it left behind was a ringing, deafening thing. I stood in my study, the receiver still in my hand, and I stared at the wall of books, at the tangible evidence of a life of the mind, a life of substance, a life that my own daughter had just dismissed as a reputational risk. I did not cry. The hurt was too deep, too profound for something as simple as cleansing as tears. It was a cold, quiet, and deeply, deeply internal hemorrhage. It was the feeling of a vital organ, a part of my own heart, being surgically and very precisely removed without an aesthetic. I had spent my entire life believing in the power of substance over surface, of character over charisma, of authenticity over image, and I had just been informed, by my own child, that in the world she had chosen to inhabit, those values were not just irrelevant, they were a liability. I was a liability. The casual, unthinking cruelty of her words was a devastating blow. The idea that my life, my 70 years on this earth, could be seen as a disaster for her image was a concept so monstrous, so alien to my own understanding of love and family, that for a long time I could not even process it. And Julian's laughter, that was the salt in the wound. That low, condescending chuckle from the background was a confirmation, a second voice in the chorus of my own dismissal. They were a team, a united front of ambition and a deep and very ugly social shame. I finally placed the receiver back in its cradle, the click of the plastic a small, final and deeply symbolic sound, and then, as the snippet had so accurately described, I just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, a silent acknowledgement of a terrible and now undeniable truth, and I walked away. I walked away from the phone, I walked away from the painful echoing silence of the study, and in a larger, more profound sense I walked away from the daughter I had thought I had, the daughter I had loved, the daughter who it was now devastatingly clear, did not exist. The person on the other end of that phone was a stranger, a woman so consumed by her own fragile and deeply insecure ambition, that she had amputated her own history, her own mother, to make her ascent a little lighter, a little easier. The deep, soul-crushing hurt did not break me. It did not send me into a spiral of grief and despair. It did something else. It crystallized. It hardened, in the cold, quiet crucible of my broken heart, into a single sharp and absolutely unshakably clear resolve. My plan was born in that moment of profound and deeply clarifying pain. It was not a plan for revenge, not in the hot, messy emotional sense. It was a plan for a rebalancing of the scales. It was a plan for a lesson, a quiet, elegant and deeply, deeply necessary lesson in the nature of true value, of true class, and of the profound, and often brutal difference between a reputation and a legacy. The next morning I did not call my sister to weep and seek comfort. I did not call a friend to complain and solicit sympathy. The hurt was a private and now very powerful engine, and I was not going to dilute its fuel with the well-meaning but ultimately useless pity of others. Instead, I sat down at the beautiful antique Louis XVI writing desk in my study, a desk that was, in itself, a testament to my own quiet success, a piece that was worth more than my daughter's least luxury car. I took out a piece of my heavy cream-colored personal stationery, and I made my first and most important call. It was to my estate lawyer, a quiet, methodical, and deeply loyal man named Jonathan Miller, who had handled my and my late husband's affairs for over 20 years. He answered on the second ring, his voice the calm, reassuring, and deeply professional tone I had come to rely on. "Evelyn," he said, his voice warm. "It's good to hear from you. I trust you are well." "I am well, Jonathan, thank you," I said, and my voice was as calm, as measured, and as professional as his. There was no trace of the emotional devastation of the previous day. I was not a grieving mother, I was a client, a very wealthy client, with a very specific and very urgent legal instruction. I am calling because I need to make an immediate and very significant change to my will. There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause on the other end of the line. Jonathan was not just my lawyer, he was a shrewd observer of our family dynamics. He had seen Simone's casual, dismissive treatment of me at my husband's funeral. He had heard her speak of my modest life, with a tone of faint but unmistakable condescension. He was, I was sure, not entirely surprised by this call. "I see," he said, his voice now all business, the lawyer taking precedence over the old family friend. "What kind of change did you have in mind, Evelyn?" I took a deep, steadying breath. This was the first and most irrevocable step. This was the moment the plan moved from a theoretical emotional response into a concrete legal reality. "I want to remove my daughter Simone Hayes Sterling," I said, my voice as cold and as clear as a winter morning, "as the primary beneficiary of my entire estate." The silence on the other end of the line was long, and I am sure deeply satisfied. "The entire estate?" he finally asked, his voice a low, professional murmur, confirming the breathtaking scope of my instruction. "The entire estate," I repeated. "The house, the art collection, the investment portfolio, the contents of the Dubois Family Foundation, all of it. Her name is to be completely and irrevocably erased." I did not need to explain why. I did not need to recount the story of the painful, humiliating phone call. Jonathan was too good a lawyer and too wise a man to ask for the messy emotional details. He understood that a woman like me, a woman of quiet, deliberate, and deeply considered actions, would not make a decision of this magnitude lightly. He understood that a line, a very profound and very final line, had been crossed. "I understand, Evelyn," he said, his voice now a quiet, efficient hum of professional purpose. "I will draft the necessary codicil immediately. It will be a simple but absolute amendment. I will have the documents ready for your signature by this afternoon." "Thank you, Jonathan," I said. The call was over. It had taken less than 5 minutes. The first and most devastating step of my plan was in motion. My daughter, who was so worried about her reputation, had no idea that she had just, with a single cruel and deeply foolish phone call, lost something far, far more valuable. She had lost her future. That afternoon, I drove to Jonathan Miller's quiet, respectable downtown office. The codicil, legal instrument of my daughter's disinheritance, was ready. It was a single elegant and deeply brutal page of legal text, typed on heavy watermarked paper. I sat at his large, polished mahogany conference table, the same table where years ago my late husband and I had signed the original will, a document full of a hopeful and now deeply ironic love for our only child. Jonathan read the key clause aloud, his voice a dispassionate legal drone. "All previous bequests, trusts, and articles pertaining to my daughter Simone Hayes Sterling are hereby rendered null and void. She is to be formally and completely removed as a beneficiary of this estate." The words, so simple, so clinical, so absolute, were a legal execution. They were the erasure of a lifetime of maternal intention. "And the new beneficiary?" Jonathan asked gently, his pen hovering over the final section of the document. "Who is to be the recipient of the estate now?" I looked at him and I smiled a small, sad and deeply strategic smile. "Leave it blank for now, Jonathan," I said. "Just for a little while. Let's just create a void." He understood immediately. This was not just a legal act. It was a strategic one. By not immediately naming a new beneficiary, I was keeping my options open. I was creating a space, a vacuum into which my final and most profound statement would be made. He nodded, a look of profound and deeply appreciative respect in his old wise eyes. "A void it is," he said. He handed me his own heavy fountain pen. I signed my name, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, at the bottom of the page, my signature the same clear, confident, and utterly unshakable script I had used for 40 years. His paralegal, a quiet and very discreet young woman, signed as the witness. It was done. With a few simple strokes of a pen, my daughter's $7.5 million future had been completely and utterly erased. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I felt only a profound and deeply cleansing sense of release. It was the feeling a surgeon has after a long, difficult, and deeply necessary amputation. The diseased limb, the part of my life that had been causing me so much pain, so much heartache, had been removed. The wound was deep, and I knew the phantom pains would linger for a long time. But the cancer of my daughter's entitlement, of her disrespect, of her profound and deeply hurtful lack of love, had been excised, and I was, at long last, going to heal. I let 2 days pass, 2 days of a beautiful and deeply satisfying silence. I knew that my own silence, my lack of any further emotional reaction to her cruel dismissal, would be unsettling for Simone. It did not fit her narrative of the difficult emotional mother. Then on the 3rd day I made my next move. I called her. I was no longer the wounded mother. I was an actress playing a part in a play of my own devising. My voice, when she answered, was a perfect mask of maternal warmth, of a slightly flustered and deeply apologetic contrition. "Simone, darling," I began, my voice a soft, gentle murmur. "I am so sorry to bother you. I know how incredibly insanely busy you are with the awards night." "Mom," she said, her own voice a little wary, a little suspicious, braced for another round of emotional conflict. "It's okay, what is it?" "I just wanted to apologize," I said, my voice full of a beautiful and entirely false sincerity. "For the other day, I was being selfish. My big silly birthday, of course it's not as important as your big night. You have worked so hard for this award, and I am so proud of you." I was giving her everything she wanted to hear. I was validating her choice. I was accepting my own secondary role in her life. I was being the good, supportive, and deeply invisible mother she had always wanted me to be. The relief in her voice was a palpable, almost comical thing. "Oh, Mom," she said, her voice softening, the tension draining away. "It's okay, I knew you'd understand. It's a really big deal for me." "I know it is, darling," I said, "and I want to support you. In fact," I continued, my voice now a bright, enthusiastic, and deeply strategic chirp, "I know it's a fundraising gala for the PR Society, and I would be absolutely honored to buy a table, to show my support, for you and for your profession." There was a moment of surprised, and I am sure deeply suspicious, silence on her end. A table at the Golden Quill Awards was a very expensive and very public gesture. It was not the kind of thing her humble academic mother was supposed to be able to do. "A table, Mom?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. They're $10,000. "I know," I said, my voice a masterpiece of casual understatement. "I looked it up online. It's for a good cause, and I'd love to bring a few of my old friends from the museum board. It will be a wonderful evening." The mention of the museum board was a small but deeply strategic piece of bait. It was a subtle hint of a world, of a status, that she did not associate with me. Her mind, I knew, was racing. The $10,000 was, to her, an impossible and deeply intriguing sum. The presence of my museum board friends was a potential and very valuable networking opportunity, and my public and very expensive display of support would be a wonderful and very useful piece of PR for her own brand. The devoted daughter supported by her loving and surprisingly generous mother. "Mom," she said, her voice now a purr of pure, unadulterated, and deeply opportunistic delight. That is the sweetest, most generous thing you have ever done. Of course, I'll have my assistant arrange it immediately." "Oh, this is going to be wonderful." The trap was set. The bait had been taken. She had, with a heart full of a smug and deeply greedy relief, just personally invited her own executioner to the ball. With Simone's enthusiastic and deeply misguided agreement secured, I made my second and far more important strategic call. It was to Mr. Charles Blackwood, the distinguished and universally respected president of the city's Public Relations Society. He was the host, the master of ceremonies, and the ultimate arbiter of the Golden Quill Awards. He was, in my daughter's world, a god. But in my world, he was just Charles. Unbeknownst to my daughter, who saw the world in a series of rigid and deeply superficial professional hierarchies, Charles Blackwood and I were old, and very dear, friends. We had served together on the board of the Art Museum for over a decade, a shared and very passionate labor of love. He was a man of deep cultural sophistication, a man who, beneath his polished corporate exterior, had the soul of an artist and the mind of a historian. He had been a great admirer of my late husband's work, and he held my own professional opinion in the highest possible esteem. We had shared countless dinners, had engaged in 1,000 passionate and deeply satisfying debates about art, about politics, about life. He knew my character, and he knew and respected the quiet and very real depth of my philanthropic work in the city. I called him on his private line. Evelyn, he boomed, his voice a warm and deeply welcome sound of genuine and uncomplicated affection. What a wonderful surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure? Charles, my dear, I said, my own voice now losing its performative edge and becoming its real authentic self. I am calling to ask for a rather unusual favor. I framed my request not as an act of personal and deeply satisfying revenge, but as a philanthropic one. A matter of legacy, a matter of the arts, a language I knew he would understand. Charles, I said, my voice a calm and deeply considered murmur. As you know, I am turning 70 next week, and it has put me in a rather reflective mood. I have been thinking a great deal about my legacy, about what I want to leave behind. A considerable legacy, my dear Evelyn, he said, his voice full of a genuine and deeply moving respect. The north wing of the museum would not exist without you. You are too kind, I said. But I am thinking of something new. Something significant. I am planning to announce the formation of a major new arts endowment. A foundation in my family's name. Evelyn, that's magnificent, he said, his voice full of a genuine and deeply enthusiastic excitement. And I have been thinking about the perfect platform for such an announcement, I continued, my voice a masterpiece of quiet strategic understatement. And it occurred to me that your awards gala, a celebration of our city's greatest communicators, a room full of the most influential people in the city, would be the perfect and most impactful venue. I paused, letting the brilliant and deeply flattering logic of my suggestions sink in. Would there, I asked, my voice a soft and deeply hopeful question, be time in your very busy program for a special philanthropic announcement? Charles was not just pleased, he was thrilled, he was honored. The idea of announcing a major new multi-million-dollar arts foundation at his gala was a PR coup of the highest order. It would elevate his event from a simple professional awards night to a major citywide philanthropic event. Time, he boomed, his voice full of a delighted and deeply useful laughter. My dear Evelyn, for you and for an announcement of this magnitude, I will stop the entire show. We will make all the time you need. The alliance, the second and most powerful of my quiet and deeply strategic alliances, was formed. The conversation with Charles Blackwood was more than just a logistical success. It was a profound and deeply restorative act of validation. In a single 10-minute phone call he had with his genuine and deeply moving respect, erased the sting of my own daughter's profound and deeply wounding disrespect. To Simone I was a reputational risk, a humble academic mother to be managed, and if necessary hidden. To Charles, a man of true and earned status, a man whose opinion actually mattered in the world my daughter was so desperate to conquer, I was a titan of the city's cultural scene, a woman to be honored, a philanthropist whose announcement was a coup for his own prestigious event. The contrast was a beautiful and deeply satisfying irony. This is magnificent, Evelyn, Charles had continued, his mind, the mind of a brilliant PR man, already seeing the potential. A major philanthropic announcement. At the climax of the evening, it's a wonderful and very powerful piece of programming. It will add a layer of substance, of gravitas to the entire event. He was not just accommodating my request, he was embracing it. He was making my plan a central and very celebrated part of his own. We will position it just before the final award of the evening, the PR Professional of the Year, he said, and I had to smile at the beautiful and deeply poetic justice of the timing. It will be the emotional high point of the night. A moment of true and very welcome inspiration. He had no idea, of course, of the true and very personal drama that was about to unfold. He saw this only as a wonderful and very public act of generosity. He was the perfect and most unsuspecting instrument of my plan. He was a man of such unimpeachable integrity, of such universal respect in his field, that his participation would lend my announcement an aura of profound and deeply unassailable legitimacy. No one would question it, no one would dare. And you must of course be my guest of honor at the head table, he had insisted. No, Charles, I had said, my voice firm, that is the one thing I must insist upon. I have already bought a table. I am coming as a guest of my daughter Simone. It is a family matter. I would prefer to be seated with my own party, quietly, in the background. My request, I knew, would seem eccentric to him, a charming and deeply humble quirk of a wealthy and very private woman. As you wish, Evelyn, he had said, a note of amused and deeply respectful curiosity in his voice. You have always been a woman of quiet and very definite tastes. The alliance was formed. It was an alliance built not on the shifting treacherous sands of familial obligation, but on the solid granite bedrock of mutual and very real respect. Charles Blackwood, the man my daughter so desperately wanted to impress, was now my willing and very powerful co-conspirator, and he had no idea that the beautiful, inspirational, and deeply philanthropic event he was so excited to be a part of was also a quiet, elegant, and deeply satisfying act of personal and very public revenge. The night of the PR Professional of the Year awards arrived, a glittering high-stakes affair held in the grand ballroom of the city's newest and most fashionable five-star hotel. The room was a sea of black tie and designer gowns, a living, breathing testament to the power and the vanity of the city's public relations industry. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, of ambition, and of a deep and almost palpable anxiety. Simone and Julian were the undisputed power couple of the evening. They glided through the glittering, schmoozing crowd, their smiles bright, their confidence a brilliant and very convincing performance. Simone was in a stunning and I knew astronomically expensive, red sequined gown, a dress that was a declaration of war, a demand to be seen. She was the front-runner for the big award, and she was radiating the energy of a woman who knows she is about to win. I, in contrast, made a quiet and very deliberate entrance. I did not arrive in my old reliable Volvo. I had hired a car service, a discreet black town car that was the very definition of understated old-money elegance, and I was not wearing my usual, humble academic attire. My dress was a custom gown from a very quiet, very old, and very expensive Parisian designer, a designer whose name was not a household word, but was to the very few, very wealthy, and very knowledgeable women in the room, a secret handshake, a quiet and very powerful signal of a different and far more formidable level of wealth. It was a simple architectural column of deep, midnight blue silk, a dress that did not glitter but seemed to absorb the light, a dress that was a statement of pure, unadulterated, and very confident elegance. But it was the necklace that was the true and most strategic weapon in my quiet sartorial arsenal. It was not a modern, flashy piece of bling. It was a breathtaking and very famous antique diamond and sapphire necklace, a piece I had acquired at a private auction years ago, a piece that had once belonged to a European princess. It was a historic, museum-quality piece, a piece that was instantly recognizable to the city's small and very insular elite. I walked into the ballroom, and the effect was exactly as I had intended. It was not a loud head-turning entrance. It was a quiet and far more powerful one. A few very important people in the room, the wives of the city's biggest CEOs, the old money philanthropists who sat on the museum board, saw the necklace, and their eyes, their very well-trained and deeply appreciative eyes, widened. A quiet and very respectful murmur went through the upper echelons of the room. A new and very interesting player had just very quietly entered the game. Simone, who was in the middle of a charming, animated conversation with the editor of the city's most influential lifestyle magazine, saw me enter, and her face for a moment was a perfect and deeply satisfying portrait of pure, unadulterated, and deeply panicked shock. This was not the mother she had been expecting. This was not the humble academic and slightly embarrassing woman in the sensible shoes and the custom-made but deeply unbranded dress. This was a different woman entirely, a woman of elegance, of power, and of a quiet and deeply intimidating wealth that she did not and could not understand. The necklace in particular was a declaration, a statement in a language of wealth so far above her own, that it had left her completely and utterly speechless. She was horrified. This was not part of her plan. Her mother was not supposed to be a rival, a competitor, a woman who could, with a single quiet and deeply confident entrance, steal her spotlight. Her mother was supposed to be a quiet, grateful, and deeply invisible guest, a small and slightly embarrassing footnote in the grand, triumphant narrative of her own perfect night. She excused herself from her conversation and rushed to my side, her face a mask of bright, false, and deeply anxious welcome. "Mom," she hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper under the cover of a brilliant and very public smile. "What are you wearing? That necklace. Where did you get that?" "It's just a little something from my collection, darling," I said, my own voice a calm and deeply infuriating murmur. "Well, it's a little much, don't you think?" she said, her eyes darting around the room, assessing the damage to her own brand. "It's a little ostentatious." The irony, of course, was so profound, so absolute, that it was almost beautiful. My daughter, a woman whose entire life was a performance of ostentatious and largely fraudulent wealth, was accusing me, a woman of real and very quiet wealth, of being tacky. She gave me a curt, cold and deeply dismissive greeting. And then in a final and deeply foolish act of petty and very public retaliation, she proceeded to pointedly and completely ignore me for the rest of the evening. She led me to my table, the one I had so generously purchased. It was not, as I had expected, a good table. It was a bad table, a table in the very back of the ballroom, near the service entrance, a table populated by the most junior and most insignificant associates from her own firm. It was a public and very clear declaration of my status. I was a nobody. I was an afterthought. The public humiliation, so petty, so childish, so deeply, and so beautifully self-destructive, was the final straw. It was the final and most profound confirmation of my own quiet and deeply righteous resolve. I sat at my bad table, a quiet, elegant, and deeply underestimated queen in exile. And I waited, with a calm and very, very patient, and very, very satisfied smile, for the moment of my own very public and very, very spectacular coronation. The ceremony began, a long, tedious, and deeply self-congratulatory affair. A parade of ambitious and deeply insecure PR executives took the stage to accept awards for Best Social Media Campaign, Most Innovative Brand Activation, and a dozen other equally meaningless and self-invented categories. The speeches were a blur of corporate jargon, a false humility of a deep and almost pathetic need for validation. I sat at my table in the back of the room, a quiet and deeply amused anthropologist, observing the strange and deeply fascinating rituals of this foreign and very, very shallow tribe. I made polite and very minimal conversation with the young and deeply intimidated junior associates at my table, who looked at me, at my dress, at my necklace, with a mixture of awe, of confusion, and of a deep and very real fear. As the evening wore on, the tension and the anticipation in the room began to build. The final and most important award of the evening, the PR Professional of the Year, was approaching, and my daughter Simone was the undisputed and very clear front-runner. She was glowing. She was radiant. She was in her own mind already the winner. Her face was a mask of confident and very practiced humility. She had, I was sure, her acceptance speech. A speech that was, I had no doubt, a masterpiece of false modesty and self-congratulation, already memorized. This was her moment. The moment she had been working for, scheming for, and I am sure in her own strange and deeply transactional way, praying for, her entire adult life. This was the moment that would, in her mind, finally and irrevocably validate her. It would prove that she was not just the humble academic daughter of a quiet, and in her eyes deeply unsuccessful, mother. It would prove that she was a star, a success, a brand in her own right. The build-up to the climax was a slow and deeply satisfying burn. I watched her, my daughter, my child, my stranger, on the cusp of her greatest triumph, a triumph that was, in a few short and very, very delicious moments, about to be completely and utterly and very, very publicly and very, very satisfyingly upstaged. The room was a powder keg of ambition and ego, and I, her quiet, ignored and deeply underestimated mother, was about to light the fuse. The presenter for the final award, a former and very famous news anchor, took the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause. The air in the room was thick with a final and very palpable burst of anticipation. And now, the presenter boomed, his voice a familiar and very authoritative baritone, the moment we have all been waiting for, the award for the Golden Quill PR Professional of the Year. He opened the envelope. I could see Simone at her table, her hand clutching her husband's, her face a mask of perfect camera-ready and deeply expectant joy. But just as the presenter was about to announce the winner, a figure, a calm, distinguished and very familiar figure, walked onto the stage. It was the host of the evening, the president of the PR Society, Mr. Charles Blackwood. He walked to the podium and held up a hand, a quiet and very authoritative gesture that immediately silenced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice a warm and deeply respectful boom, "please forgive the interruption, but before we present our final and most prestigious award of the evening, we have a very special and very significant philanthropic announcement to be made. An announcement from a true and very quiet titan of our city's cultural scene." A wave of confused and deeply intrigued murmurs rippled through the room. A philanthropic announcement? This was not on the program. This was an unexpected and very, very interesting plot twist. I saw Simone and Julian exchange a confused and deeply annoyed look. This was their moment. Her moment. And it was being interrupted. The carefully constructed and deeply self-important narrative of her perfect night was being for a moment, and very, very rudely, hijacked. They had no idea that it was not just being hijacked. It was about to be completely and utterly and very, very beautifully and very, very satisfyingly derailed. Charles Blackwood stood at the podium, a master of ceremonies in his own, grand and now very, very useful production. He let the confused and deeply intrigued murmur of the crowd build for a moment. A practiced and very effective piece of public speaking theater. Tonight, he continued, his voice now taking on a tone of deep and genuine and very public respect. We are honored to have with us a woman whose quiet generosity, whose brilliant and deeply discerning eye, and whose profound and very personal commitment to the arts have shaped the cultural landscape of our city for decades. Simone and Julian were now looking around the room, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and a dawning, and deeply unpleasant, curiosity. Who was this titan? Who was this mysterious and clearly very important philanthropist who was so rudely and so publicly upstaging their perfect night? She is a woman I have had the profound honor of serving with on the board of the Art Museum for over a decade. Charles boomed, his voice now ringing with a personal and very powerful endorsement. She is a woman whose opinion I value above almost all others. She is a woman I am deeply and very personally proud to call a friend. He paused, a final dramatic and deeply satisfying beat. And then he turned, and instead of looking at the front tables, at the recognized and very public philanthropists of the city, he looked directly to the back of the room. Directly to my table, the bad table, the table of the junior associates of the nobodies, the table where my daughter had so publicly and so foolishly banished me. And a single powerful and deeply beautifully symbolic spotlight cut through the dim ambient light of the ballroom, and it landed with a perfect and very, very satisfying precision on me. Please welcome, Charles Blackwood announced, his voice a triumphant and deeply satisfying roar, to make a very special and very, very significant announcement, my dear friend. The former chief curator of our city's great art museum, Dr. Evelyn Hayes. The host had called my name. The play, my play, was about to begin. As the spotlight hit me, a new and very different kind of silence fell over the room. It was not the awkward, uncomfortable silence of my earlier humiliation. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated and deeply, deeply satisfying shock. I calmly and with a grace I did not feel but was determined to project, approached the stage. My son-in-law's jaw, a jaw that had just a few hours before been set in a line of smug, condescending amusement, had literally and very, very satisfyingly dropped open. He was staring at me, at the woman in the quiet, elegant dress, and the very, very not quiet, and very, very not elegant necklace, as if he were seeing a ghost. A very, very wealthy and very, very powerful ghost. I took the microphone from a beaming and deeply complicit Charles Blackwood. I looked out at the sea of stunned, and now deeply respectfully silent faces. I began warmly, my voice the calm, measured, and deeply authoritative voice of a curator, a professor, a woman who is used to commanding the attention of a room. Thank you, Charles, I said, and thank you all. I am so honored to be here tonight, to celebrate the incredible talent and creativity of our city's communications professionals. I turned my warm and deeply false smile on my daughter, whose own beautiful and now deeply panicked face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending and very, very satisfying horror. I am especially proud, I said, my voice full of a beautiful and deeply fraudulent maternal pride, to be here to support my brilliant daughter Simone. And then, I made my announcement. I am turning 70 years old this week, I said, my voice now taking on a new and deeply personal note. And a milestone birthday, as many of you in this room know, puts one in a rather reflective mood. It makes one think about one's legacy, about what one wants to leave behind. I paused, letting the room and my daughter absorb the full, and now very, very pregnant meaning of my words. And so, I announced, my voice ringing with a new and very, very public and very, very satisfying clarity. I have decided to mark this milestone, and to honor my late husband's lifelong commitment to the arts, by announcing tonight the formation of a new and very significant philanthropic foundation. I gestured to the large screen behind me, whereon a silent and very beautiful cue from a technician who had been very well briefed by Charles, a new and very elegant graphic appeared. It was the logo for the foundation, a logo I had designed myself. The Hayes Foundation for the Arts, I announced, my voice a triumphant and deeply satisfying roar, will be endowed upon my death with my entire personal fortune of $7.5 million. The room erupted in a standing ovation, a thunderous and deeply, deeply satisfying wave of pure, unadulterated and very public admiration. The standing ovation was a beautiful and deeply satisfying sound. It was the sound of my quiet, private life, a life of substance, of passion, of a deep and very real wealth. Finally and very publicly being acknowledged, being celebrated. But on the stage, and at the head table, a very different and very silent drama was unfolding. Simone and Julian were frozen, their faces pale with a shared and deeply abject horror. They had just witnessed their inheritance, the $7.5 million that had been the unspoken and very, very real foundation of their own, fragile and deeply leveraged life of luxury, be publicly and irrevocably given away. I held up a hand, a quiet and very authoritative gesture for silence. The room after a moment settled back into a hushed and deeply expectant quiet. I looked for the last time at my daughter, at her beautiful and now completely and utterly ruined face. My daughter, I said, and my voice was no longer the voice of a mother warm and forgiving. It was the voice of a judge, a curator, a woman who was delivering a final and very public and very, very satisfying verdict. My daughter recently reminded me of how very, very important one's reputation is in this world. I let the words, her own shallow and deeply cruel words, hang in the silent and now deeply scandalized air. And she is right, I continued, my voice a clear and ringing, and deeply final statement of my own, and now very, very public values. And so I realized, on my 70th birthday, that my own legacy, my own reputation, my own name, should be tied forever, not to individuals who may not fully and completely appreciate its value, but to the enduring and timeless and deeply meaningful beauty of the arts. I gave a small, dignified and deeply final nod. I placed the microphone gently back on its stand, the small, soft sound of final and very, very satisfying period at the end of a very, very long and very, very painful sentence. And then, I turned, and I walked off the stage, leaving my daughter, my child, my stranger, in the silent, public and deeply, deeply satisfying ruin of a reputation that had just in the space of 5 short and very, very beautiful minutes, cost her everything.